Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are today, and welcome to our webinar, Our Children's Fear Immigration Policy Effects on Young Children. My name is Wendy Cervantes, and I'm a Senior Policy Analyst for Immigration and Immigrant Families with the Center for Law and Social Policy, or CLASP. CLASP is a national, nonpartisan, anti-poverty organization that advocates for public policies that improve the lives of low-income children, youth, and families. We work on a range of policy issues such as child care and early education, income and work supports, job quality, youth policy, and others. On behalf of CLASP, I want to thank you all for joining us today. I also like to introduce you to my two colleagues who will be presenting with me today. Hannah Matthews, who's our Director of Child Care and Early Education here at CLASP, and Rebecca Ulrich, who's a Policy Analyst with the Child Care and Early Education team as well. Today, we're going to be talking about two brand new reports from our Compromising Our Nation's Future project, which focuses on the impact of immigration policy on young children as well as early childhood programs. Our goal today is to provide you with information, recommendations, and resources to help you better serve and advocate for children and families who may be impacted by the rapidly changing immigration policy context. Before we get started, I'd like to quickly mention some housekeeping items. As you join the webinar, your phone lines were automatically muted and will remain muted for the duration of the webinar. We'll save time at the end to take questions from the audience. To submit questions, please send them via the chat box. You can also use the chat box to alert us regarding any technical issues you're experiencing. The presentation and recording will be available after the webinar on our website at www.clasp.org. Next slide, please. Great, let's get started. As an overview, here are some of the topics we'll cover today. First, I'll briefly discuss the current immigration context as it relates to young children. Second, Rebecca will provide an overview of our research project and key findings. And then Hannah will share some recommendations for policymakers, practitioners, and philanthropy. And finally, we'll open it up to your questions. Next slide, please. So getting started with the immigration context from an early childhood perspective. Next slide. First, it's important to recognize that children and immigrant families make up a significant portion of our increasingly diverse young child population. 1 in 4 children ages 8 and younger live in an immigrant family, and the vast majority are U.S. citizens. Most children in immigrant families live with parents who have some form of lawful immigration status, and approximately 5 million children live in mixed status families with at least one undocumented parent, including 1.6 million young children under the age of 5. Next slide, please. It's also important to recognize that children of immigrants are geographically dispersed. As you'll see from this map, the states in red are those where children of immigrants comprise more than 30% of the child population. Orange is where they comprise more than 20%, and light orange is where they now comprise more than 10%. So you can see that this demographic shift has national implications. Next slide, please. In addition to changing demographics, our research was driven by the dramatic shift in immigration policy since the beginning of the Trump administration. As it relates to early childhood, there are 3 themes that stood out in our research, including increased enforcement, removing protections for groups previously granted discretion, and efforts to restrict immigrants' families' access to public benefit programs. Next slide. As many of you may recall, in January 2017, President Trump introduced 2 immigration executive orders focused on enforcement on the southwest border and in the interior of the United States. These orders significantly expanded enforcement, calling for triple the number of agents and encouraging collaboration with local police to apprehend undocumented immigrants. And as a result, we've seen ICE enforcement in communities increase by as much as 146% over the past year. The enforcement orders also eliminated priorities for deportation that had been put in place by the previous administration, effectively making all removable immigrants a priority for deportation, including parents of U.S. citizen children. It also restricted the extent to which immigration officials can use prosecutorial discretion on a case-by-case basis. As a result, we've seen a significant increase in cases of parents who previously were granted discretion on the condition that they check in regularly with ICE and are now showing up to their annual check-ins and being placed into deportation proceedings. Next slide, please. We've also seen populations that were previously granted discretion having their protections stripped away. For example, many of our site visits happened after the Trump administration announced the termination of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA program, on September 5th of last year, which is the program that was introduced by the Obama administration in 2012 that provides 2 years of renewable reprieve from deportation and work permits to certain undocumented immigrants who came to the U.S. as children. The DACA program has helped change the lives of more than 800,000 immigrant youth and young adults, a quarter of whom are parents of young U.S. citizen children. It's also important to flag that approximately 40,000 DACA recipients work in the education, health, and social service field, and many are in the early childhood field. Loss of DACA status means more than just being at greater risk of deportation. It also means loss of employment, employer-sponsored health insurance, and other benefits like access to a driver's license and in-state tuition, which impacts not only beneficiaries, but also their children, families, and communities. Next slide. Finally, there have also been several legislative and administrative proposals over the past year that seek to restrict immigrants and their families' access to basic health and nutrition assistance and other critical income supports. Rebecca will cover in more detail what our interviews with early childhood providers and parents revealed about their concerns. But one of the proposals was a draft executive order on something known as public charge that was leaked to the press in January of 2017. And although it was never issued, it created a chilling effect, driving even lawfully present immigrants not to enroll themselves or their children in programs they're eligible for, out of concern that doing so could jeopardize their ability to obtain a green card in the future. Next slide. We're now looking at a new threat related to public charge. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this term, let me just provide a quick overview. Under immigration law, a public charge is someone who has been determined to be or likely to be dependent on the government for his or her subsistence, and this determination is based on various different factors. The determination is made when a person applies to enter the U.S. on a family-based visa or when they are applying to become a lawful permanent resident. And being determined to be a public charge can make them ineligible to either enter the country or qualify for a green card. The only types of public benefit assistance that have been considered to fall under the public charge grounds are cash benefits like TANF or SSI or long-term care at government expense. Programs like SNAP, WIC, or Medicaid, which most lawful immigrants already have to wait at least 5 years to access, have never been considered in this determination before. However, the Trump administration is now working on a proposed rule which is expected to be published in the Federal Register very soon that would significantly expand the list of services and programs that could make someone a public charge. That list could include programs like non-cash TANF benefits like child care and transportation assistance, health programs like SNAP and WIC, homeless shelters and housing assistance, and educational benefits under Head Start. Use of benefits by an individual's dependents, including their U.S. citizen children, are also likely to be included in the definition. This is a threat that CLASP is monitoring very closely through our Protecting Immigrant Families campaign, and we'll be providing updates for how you can take action. In our report, you will find out ways to engage with the work of our campaign and how to fight back against this threat. In the meantime, I do want to stress that this pending rule will take time to implement as it has to go through the rulemaking process. So immigrants should be assured that there is likely no benefit to disenrolling from any public benefit at this time. It's also important to stress that this proposed rule does nothing to impact immigrant or their children's eligibility for public benefits. So all immigrant eligibility rules impacting Head Start and CCDBG programs remain in place, and this proposed rule does nothing to change that. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to my colleague, Rebecca Ulrich, to talk about the report's findings.
Thanks, Wendy. Next slide, please. So as a reminder, we'll be taking questions at the end of the presentation, so please submit any of your questions to the chat box. Now, our study was motivated by widespread reports that children and families are being harmed by the administration's rhetoric and immigration policy priorities. We already know, thanks to a growing body of research, that enforcement-driven immigration policies are harmful to children's health and development as well as their economic security. we felt it was especially important to understand how the current context is affecting our nation's youngest children, given the critical nature of experiences in the first few years of life for children's long-term well-being. Next slide, please. Between May and November of last year, we conducted semi-structured interviews with child care and early education providers and community-based social service providers in 6 states: California, Georgia, Illinois, New Mexico, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. Collectively, we spoke with more than 100 staff across 33 organizations. We also convened 4 focus groups in California, New Mexico, and Pennsylvania with a total of 45 immigrant parents of young children. Next slide. We detail the findings of these interviews in 2 reports. Our Children's Fear, Immigration Policies' Effects on Young Children is broadly focused on the effects of policy changes to children and immigrant families, while Immigration Policies' Harmful Impacts on Early Care and Education details how professionals who care for these children are coping with the changing context. We'll start by discussing the key findings from both reports and then talk through the recommendations. Next slide. One of the most consistent things we heard from parents and providers is that children and their families are afraid. While young children's understanding of immigration policy is limited, we heard that children as young as 3 years old are expressing fears related to the possibility of being separated from their parents. They're worried about their parents' safety, but they're also worried about their own. Who will take care of them if their parent is deported? For example, a counselor in North Carolina described a little boy who was writing down the types of sandwiches that he knew how to cook and sharing them with his 5-year-old sister in order to reassure her that they would be okay if their parents were deported. Providers indicated that children's distress was also evident in behaviors such as self-harm, increased aggression, and increased withdrawal. Providers could not always attribute a specific cause of the changes they observed, but observations across early care and education programs were consistent and not limited to children with an undocumented parent. Teachers with long tenures in the field described children's behavior as markedly different from previous years. For example, a provider in California said that following the election, children had a hard time saying goodbye to their parents at drop-off. They were crying and distressed for longer periods of time. A pre-K teacher in Georgia described children in her class as less engaged and more reluctant to talk than in past classes. Some providers described especially alarming behaviors, such as a 5-year-old boy whose anxiety was so severe that he was biting his fingertips to the point that they were bleeding. Children whose families had been affected by enforcement actions, in particular children who witnessed their parents' arrest or were present during a home raid, seemed to display the most significant behavioral changes. Providers described children refusing to talk, having toileting accidents, spontaneously crying throughout the day, and becoming clingy with the remaining parent in the aftermath of deportation. This kind of heightened, persistent stress and anxiety experienced in early childhood can have serious and lasting effects on children's physical and emotional development. Our conversations with parents and providers suggest that it's not just children with undocumented parents who are experiencing this constant worry. Elevated fear extended to children whose parents have lawful immigration status as well, some even children of U.S. citizens. However, the very real threat of family separation makes children with undocumented parents, in particular those who actually lose a parent to deportation, at the greatest risk of health and developmental issues. Next slide, please. Fear is also keeping families isolated in their homes and out of their communities, putting children's daily routines in turmoil. Parents and providers describe families doing anything they can to make themselves less vulnerable to immigration enforcement. In many states, traffic stops are the most common way that undocumented immigrants are taken into custody. Consequently, many parents have limited when, where, and how far they drive, and some leave their homes only for necessary activities, like going to work or buying groceries. The lack of public transportation in many communities leaves families with few options for getting around. As a result, children may be secluded in their homes for days or even weeks at a time. This withdrawal from ordinary life means children are losing out on enriching experiences, staying home from childcare and school, no longer going to the park to play or to the library for story time or running errands as a family. Participating in regular routines provide children with opportunities to practice developing skills and gives them a sense of safety and security. They know what to expect and when to expect it. Disrupting routines with trusted caregivers and reducing access to critical community services, particularly during a time of heightened stress and uncertainty, may make children more vulnerable to the most harmful effects of anxiety. Next slide, please. Early childhood providers talked extensively about lower rates of attendance in their programs, particularly after the election, major policy announcements, and real or rumored raids in the community. In some cases, children have withdrawn from programs altogether. Some programs described declines in referrals or new enrollments. One pre-K program said they received close to 100 fewer new applications in the spring of 2017 compared to the previous year. Another said they've had trouble filling spaces and they were scrounging for children. Several home visiting programs said their referrals went down or even ceased altogether in the months immediately after the election. Providers also described lower family engagement and fewer parents coming to volunteer in the classroom than in past years. Many attributed declines in enrollment and spotty attendance to a lack of transportation options for parents. For many children, attending an early childhood program is an important part of their daily routine. Trusted caregivers, including teachers, home visitors, and other early childhood providers, can provide nurturing care and stability when everything else in a child's world is uncertain. But children and families can't reap the benefits of high-quality programs if they don't feel safe attending or enrolling. Next slide. In every state we visited, we heard of families' growing concerns about enrolling or maintaining enrollment in other publicly funded health and nutrition programs, even for their U.S. citizen children, meaning some children are losing out on services that support their healthy development. We most frequently heard about families withdrawing from WIC and SNAP, but also heard from some providers that fears have extended to Medicaid as well. We heard that some moms are receiving prenatal care late in their pregnancies, and there are increased no-shows at health clinics. Parents are afraid that participating in these programs or receiving these services will affect their ability to obtain lawful status, apply for citizenship, or make them identifiable to immigration enforcement agencies. Providers noted that immigrant parents have always had concerns about enrolling in these programs, but that fears have been more acute recently, particularly after the election and the leaked executive order in March of 2017 that Wendy mentioned earlier in the presentation. And again, as Wendy said, immigrant families' eligibility for public benefits remains unchanged. In some cases, providers were able to confidently reassure families that accessing these programs is safe and were able to maintain their participation. This seemed most common among programs that had deep roots in their communities and who had long histories of working with immigrant families. But in many other cases, providers reported that families are declining to enroll, withdrawing their enrollment, or choosing not to reapply despite reassurances. Limited mobility related to fear of coming into contact with immigration agents also affected families' access to important services. For instance, parents in Pennsylvania said they have hesitated to take their children in for emergency care because ICE patrols the route to the hospital. A child with autism in Georgia is no longer receiving therapy services because his father can't risk driving him to his appointments, and public transportation is not an option. You'll note that our findings are consistent with media reports that immigrant families are declining to obtain SNAP and WIC and staying away from community hospitals and health centers. This is incredibly concerning in light of what we know about the positive impact of these programs and services on children's long-term health and their economic security. Next slide. Elevated fear and anxiety, disrupted routines, and a loss of access to early childhood, health, and nutrition services all come at a time when children in immigrant families are experiencing increased economic and housing instability as well. Parents and providers reported that undocumented immigrants are experiencing sudden job loss, sometimes from positions they'd held for many years, and difficulty finding work in the new climate. Families are moving in with extended family or friends to save money. One child in North Carolina told his kindergarten teacher that 11 people were living in his house. Other families are moving frequently to make themselves difficult to find by immigration agents. Providers and parents also reported greater rates of exploitation by landlords and employers. Unstable and exploitive conditions undermine families' economic security, negatively affect their living conditions, and create immense stress for parents and caregivers. Collectively, this stress and instability can harm children's developing minds and bodies. Next slide. Parents are also struggling with difficult decisions around preparing for deportation, and some are experiencing their own mental health issues as a result. Early childhood providers said parents were coming to them with new concerns and requests for information. For example, they were looking for mental health and stress management, free or pro bono legal services, information on immigration policy changes and know your rights, and information on creating a family safety plan and power of attorney. Notably, resources in the community, like free or affordable legal aid and mental health care, are limited, making it difficult for providers to connect families with support. Parents are doing their best to manage in unmanageable situations, but for many, the stress is overwhelming, especially given that they are often unable to get the information and the resources that they need. Parents' stress can have an impact on children's well-being, both because their worries and fears are passed down to children directly, and because being preoccupied with other concerns can get in the way of effective caregiving. Next slide. The early childhood providers we spoke with are also feeling worried and overwhelmed by the current context. Many of the resources parents are seeking fall outside their expertise, and they feel unprepared to meet families' changing needs. A Head Start provider told us, "We are family outreach workers, so what we do is provide information that the parents require. But for immigration, I feel like I am learning step by step, but I don't have enough resources to provide for the families." This increased pressure is stressful and emotionally draining for providers. They're working overtime to meet families' needs, but also feeling great concern as they witness families' duress firsthand. Most illustrative of the emotional demands on early childhood staff was the common experience of being asked by a parent to take care of their child in the event that they were arrested or deported. Multiple providers, especially home visitors and family support staff, told stories of being asked by parents to consider guardianship of their children. In many cases, the families they serve don't have relatives in the United States, and the parents perceived their home visitor as someone that they could trust to care for their child in their absence. Next slide. Importantly, many of the staff members in the programs we visited reflected the communities they were serving, and therefore were not just experiencing increased stress professionally, but personally as well. A provider in Illinois told us, "This is not just affecting our parents, it's affecting our staff. Our staff are community members too." Staff of differing religious and ethnic backgrounds, legally residing immigrants, and U.S. citizens all expressed concerns about how people in their communities perceive them and voiced fear about increased racism and xenophobia. Additionally, some staff members were directly affected by policy changes, such as the president's decision to terminate the DACA program. Providers in several states said their staff with DACA were worried about how the decision would allow them to continue their ability to work and further their education. Next slide. While all providers acknowledge that the immigration policy context has affected their work, their organizations' responses to the changes varied. Some programs perceive immigration-related issues as a core component of the work they've always done and didn't feel that their work or organizational approach had changed. Others recognized that they needed to take on new roles or are making a conscious effort to be more proactive in providing resources, trainings, and workshops relevant to immigration issues. However, several programs reported struggling to determine the best response. Publicly funded programs in particular were nervous about being perceived as taking a stance on immigration issues. A social worker in a publicly funded program said her agency seemed paralyzed by what to do. Notably, few providers indicated that they were changing practices or offering additional support for their staff despite high levels of stress, even among those who had taken significant steps to offer new resources to parents. Program leadership played a key role in determining how programs responded. Some programs described a clear directive from their boards, administrators, or other leadership to get informed and be prepared to provide resources. Conversely, mixed messages or a lack of communication from leadership left staff feeling frustrated and confused. Providers talked with great emotion about how challenging the last year had been. They described how difficult it is to juggle increased responsibility in their workplaces while they are worried about their own safety or that of their family, friends, and neighbors. The well-being of early childhood professionals mattered greatly to the efficacy of programs. Providers' ability to influence young children's development is hindered if they have unaddressed stress and lack the information, skills, supports, and partnerships necessary to support families' most pressing needs. The current emotional strain on early care and education providers is harmful both to their well-being and that of the children in their care. Next slide. Now, some of you may be familiar with the Department of Homeland Security's Sensitive Locations Policy, which restricts immigration enforcement actions in locations deemed sensitive. Most of the providers and parents we spoke with during our interviews and focus groups were aware that ICE actions were limited at places like churches, hospitals, and schools. However, few realized that the DHS definition of schools also includes early childhood programs, specifically known and licensed child care, preschools, pre-kindergarten programs, Head Start programs, and other early childhood programs. Consequently, few programs had specific internal policies related to what they would do if immigration agents tried to enter their facility and whether they would be compelled to let immigration officials into the building. Several early childhood providers reported instances of potential violations of the sensitive locations policy, circumstances in which a parent was detained on the sidewalk, outside of a program, for example, or in the parking lot. We are encouraging early childhood providers to report potential violations to ICE headquarters and to communicate the policy with their staff and with parents. You can find more information about the sensitive locations policy and how it pertains to early childhood providers in our reports. Next slide. Young children need good nutrition, regular health care, stable and healthy living environments, and nurturing and loving care in order to thrive. But harsh immigration policies are depriving millions of young children of their safety and their security. Each day, children are afraid of losing their parents, and they are expressing these fears in words and troubling behaviors. Many are becoming increasingly isolated from their communities, losing access to early care and education programs, and foregoing medical care or nutrition assistance. Some children's home lives are becoming increasingly unstable due to overcrowded housing, frequent moving, or decreased economic security. And their parents and caregivers, their primary support systems, are experiencing high levels of anxiety themselves. Children are not experiencing any of these events or their consequences in isolation. Research is clear that the harm children face is cumulative. Experiencing multiple types of hardships does far greater damage to young children's long-term development than simply adding up the effects of each individual risk factor. The result is that the development of millions of young children is likely being harmed, and many children are being denied their rights as U.S. citizens simply because their parents are not. Now, my colleague Hannah Matthews will talk through our recommendations.
Thanks, Rebecca. So we'll turn now to the recommendations that we include in our report, and I'll caveat that we won't have time to cover all of the recommendations on this webinar today, so I do encourage you to look at both reports because we include recommendations for a really broad range of stakeholders, including policymakers, advocates, practitioners, researchers, and philanthropy. Next slide. Our recommendations are based around a few key principles. Children of immigrants comprise a large share of our nation's young children. It is our nation's success will be determined by the individual success of all of our children. Therefore, our policies must allow every child to be able to seek their full potential for healthy growth, development, educational, and economic success. To that end, it's important that policymakers and advocates ensure that the best interests of children are held paramount in immigration policy decisions. We must minimize the harm that comes to children as a result of immigration policy in every possible way. Secondly, immigrant families, like all families, should have access to the programs, services, and supports that they need for their children's healthy development. And that includes any nutritional, health, and educational supports that get children off to a strong start. Next slide. We all can play a role in upholding these principles. Policymakers, advocates, and all of those who advance the well-being of children can speak up on behalf of young children of immigrants and address the developmental consequences of the array of challenges outlined in this webinar. Children's advocates and others who work on children's issues are in a particularly opportune position to speak from the perspective of child development and to speak to the well-being of children and make sure that young children's interests are safeguarded in legislation, in policy, and in implementation practices. Policies that promote increased immigration enforcement, such as state or local laws related to local police cooperation with ICE, can be seen as children's issues, as they greatly limit families' mobility, reduce children's access to services, and can lead to increased family separation. It's critical that we monitor legislation and other policy developments for their impacts on children. Specifically, at the federal level, Congress should take action to pass legislation that provides a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants, including parents of U.S. citizen children and dreamers, undocumented youth who came to the United States as children. Legislation with a path to citizenship can remove the instability that is caused by lack of status and the fear of a deportation, and enable parents to better provide for their children's basic needs. For DACA recipients and other young dreamers, passage of the DREAM Act would provide a permanent solution so that these young adults can pursue educational and career goals, which is critical for their own success and for their families. Congress should also take action to safeguard the well-being of children in immigration policy decisions and enforcement actions. This includes a range of different policies, including ensuring that impacts on children are considered when decisions are made regarding whether a parent can enter the United States or whether a parent is to be deported. Congress should also strengthen and expand the Department of Homeland Security sensitive locations policy that Rebecca talked about to clarify that operations outside of or near sensitive locations should not be permitted and to ensure uniform enforcement of the policies. DHS should also create new protocols and strengthen existing ones to minimize harm to children when enforcement operations do take place. Generally, enforcement actions should be avoided when children are present. In cases where children are there, parents should be given the opportunity to designate and contact a caregiver. Children should not be interrogated without the presence or consent of a parent or be asked to translate for parents or other family members. It's really important that all immigration enforcement agents receive training in how to appropriately handle such situations that include children in order to minimize trauma. DHS should also ensure that detained and deported parents are able to make decisions about their children's care, including for those children who may be involved in the child welfare system. Next slide, please. Yep. So we have a number of recommendations at the state policy level as well. And here, too, it's imperative that policymakers and advocates ensure that children get all public benefits for which they are eligible. This means resisting policies that deter immigrant families from health and nutrition programs, and also proactively encouraging benefit receipt. This might be through issuing guidance on immigrant eligibility for benefits and facilitating outreach to immigrant communities so that families have accurate information on accessing public programs. States can also inform families about data protection policies and confidentiality in order to encourage benefit use. We also encourage administrators of programs to monitor and analyze data on access to determine whether there are trends in reduced access to benefits in particular communities. It's important that immigrants are represented in early childhood advisory councils and other coordinating groups to ensure that the needs of all children are considered in early childhood systems conversations and that gaps in access can be identified and addressed. We also have a number of state-level recommendations related to resource needs. First, resources are desperately needed to get free and low-cost legal services to families to assist with immigration and family law issues. Secondly, our research makes clear the need to fund collaborations between early childhood education programs and immigrant-serving organizations to ensure that early childhood programs have access to credible information for immigrant families, to know their rights, and to understand how immigration policy changes impact them. Finally, our findings related to the great strain of current immigration policy on the early childhood workforce suggest a need for the funding of training and resources for the early childhood workforce itself. In particular, they need resources on trauma-informed care, including screening for trauma exposure and culturally responsive treatment, as well as addressing parent trauma, staff wellness. It's also important that we support the early childhood workforce in working with immigrant parents in how to talk to their children about these issues and to plan for possible family separation. Next slide. Our report also includes recommendations for early childhood programs. Early childhood programs can make adaptations to program practices and operations to better meet the needs of immigrant families. Staff and families are clearly better supported when attention to immigration issues comes at the director or leadership level. This is an important step in recognizing and prioritizing issues facing immigrant families, and a step towards creating space to adopt new practices and embrace new partnerships. Programs can also adopt and strengthen policies to promote children and families' safety, security, and privacy. It's important that programs inform parents about the safety of early childhood programs and ensure that all personnel are familiar with the sensitive locations policy, as well as other internal policies around safety and confidentiality. By assuring parents that their personal information is safe and will not be shared with state or federal agencies for immigration purposes, staff can help families continue to feel safe accessing early childhood programs. Next slide. Early childhood programs can also partner with community-based organizations, including immigrant serving and immigrant rights organizations, that can help staff to access the resources they need to connect parents to credible information on immigration policy, as well as individual rights, and to support parents in creating family safety plans. Lastly, while there were many commonalities across our study sites, each community experiences some of these issues differently. So it's really important for early childhood programs to reach out to community partners, to talk to families, and to try to understand the particular ways that their community may be impacted by immigration policies. With that information, partners can work together to develop community-specific solutions to address challenges, such as transportation barriers that may be keeping families from enrolling or attending programs or services. We're going to turn to your questions now. So as a reminder, please submit questions through the chat box. Next slide, please. I do want to mention, as well as the reports being available on our website, in particular, I wanted to draw your attention to the Immigration Policy's Harmful Impacts on Early Care and Education report, which has an appendix that includes resources for providers working directly with immigrant families, including information on immigrant rights and family safety planning. We will be sending these resources directly out to you after the webinar, and CLASP will also be working in the future to get additional materials to the early childhood field. We're going to pause for a minute and see what questions we have.
We have our first question. I'm curious about the public charge rule. How do you know that it is pending and is expected to be initiated soon? Well, we know that it was part of the unified agenda that was proposed in December, and we've actually seen a draft of the public charge proposed rule that was leaked to the press once again a few weeks ago. And we have it's our understanding that it's in the process of being reviewed and will be submitted to the Office of Management and Budget, and then after that it will be published in the Federal Register, and we'll get anywhere between 30 to 60 days for an open comment period. And so, as I mentioned before, that's what CLASP and our partners at the National Immigration Law Center and the many partners that are engaged with the Protecting Immigrant Families campaign will be working to monitor and to also submit as many comments as possible. So once we have information about that and have like the final rule that's published, we'll be sending information out to our networks as well. Okay, let's see, we have one other question. So what can states do to remain sanctuary state cities, particularly considering the recent, for some reason I can't see all of this question.
So there's a question around states and cities that are sanctuary cities and what could they be considering, I think, to address some of the issues raised in the presentation.
Well, that's well, and how to, I guess, to remain sanctuary states and cities, considering the administration's threat to defund these localities, and that's a great question, and it's a difficult question, and I think a lot of localities that have sanctuary policies have to make those decisions on their own based on their ability to fund the specific programs that are at risk of losing it under the threats from the administration, but this isn't an issue that CLASP works on very closely, but our partners at the National Immigration Law Center do have some tips and advice that we're happy to follow up with if you want to reach out to us directly. Our emails are on the are available in at the end of this presentation. So you can reach out to me, wcervantes@clasp.org. And I think we have another question. So there's a question about whether a family that is receiving SSI for their child who has autism, whether they can apply for a visa. So any question that's related to access to benefits and with regards to whether or not someone can enter on a specific immigrant visa is something that should be discussed with an immigration lawyer. What I wanted to stress was that currently the rules related to public charge on someone like a child who maybe is trying to enter the U.S. Through a family-based visa, those laws have right now there actually has been a change in the Foreign Affairs Manual and in determining who may be considered a public charge. But once again, this is very complicated guidance, and we advise that if there's a specific case that you're actually working on, that you consult with an immigration lawyer.
So we have another question around families that have lost protections related to the loss of TPS, temporary protective status. The question was around whether or not this is an issue that advocates are looking at. And you're right, we didn't speak to it specifically in the webinar. If you look at we actually do discuss in our report other groups that have lost protections, including TPS holders, and again, frame this as an opportunity to really think about the implications for many of the children of those TPS holders as well.
And then we also have a question about whether the findings that we shared are anecdotal or whether we have quantitative data to substantiate these findings. And the person asked if we know if these issues are due solely to immigration policy, which is a great question. And as we described, our findings were all, our interviews were all purely qualitative, and so. At this point, the findings that we are sharing in our report are anecdotal. As many of you who deal with data know, it can be really challenging to collect data that solely pinpoints immigrant children and families. But this study adds to a growing body of research that is finding anecdotal evidence that kids and families are being harmed, and there is. Some of you may be familiar with a recent study conducted by the National WIC Association that found, many of the local organizations that administer WIC are reporting these issues as well. So while the evidence is anecdotal, it's one of many anecdotal studies that are contributing to these conclusions.
So the next question is how folks can report violations of sensitive locations policy. And again, we are encouraging this. We think it's really important that there be documentation of any potential violations. We have information in the report on specifically an email address and phone number where violations can be reported to ICE enforcement and removal operations, as well as to the Civil Liberties Division of the ICE Office of Diversity and Civil Rights. Embedded within one of the early childhood report, you'll see actually what looks like one-page fact sheet on the sensitive locations policy, including information on reporting violations. Our hope is that people should feel free to actually copy and disseminate that one page as a flyer or informational material. It can be posted in early childhood programs and can help folks know when they should be reporting such violations. So please do take a look at that resource.
And we'd also encourage you to reach out to us directly about any complaints or violations that you might be directing to ICE, because we would like to be tracking that as well. And we'd also like to be of assistance, because it's our hope to push ICE to better enforce the policy and also to expand it. There was another question that just came up a few minutes ago about what happens to the children when their parents are deported. Are they placed into foster care, or what happens to them? And that there actually is a policy in place called the Parental Interest Directive that it actually requires ICE to ensure that parents are able to make decisions about their child's care, and that policy is still is being implemented. And so basically, essentially, a parent who is placed into removal proceedings is supposed to have the opportunity to decide whether or not to take their child with them or leave them behind in the care of a guardian of their choice. They're also supposed to be allowed to make phone calls at the time of apprehension to turn over a child to a designated caregiver. And ICE is supposed to help make arrangements, whether that be to take the child with the family, with the parent to the country of origin, or to remain here, and to have the arrangements necessary to pass over a child or to take a child with them. That's why we've been stressing the importance of families creating a safety plan so that they have a plan in place, and to share that plan with any other caregivers that the child might have.
We have a question about whether we found differences across states or localities based on the local political context. So, for example, those with sanctuary policies versus states or localities with more restrictive policies. So that's a great question, and there isn't really a short answer to that. We found in states like Georgia that typically has a harsher immigration policy context and where there are localities that are or local police departments that are working with federal immigration agents, that there was this really significant fear of driving, and transportation in that area certainly came up as a huge concern. But we also were in California, which is generally considered a very immigrant-friendly state, and we heard some of the more concerning stories about ICE enforcement practices in that state. So while there was some variation from place to place, we heard of concerning stories in every location that we visited.
Thanks. We have a question that is, what should a state pre-K program administrator do to support pre-K programs and Head Start programs around the public charge rule? So that's a great question. A couple of things. One is that this proposed rule, when it comes out on public charge, will be subject to public comments. So it is very important to have a very strong response. We are hoping for hundreds of thousands of comments, and it's important to put comments from all different perspectives. So the voice of those that work on early childhood will be really important. It's equally important to get accurate information to those pre-K and Head Start program providers to be able to give information to their families. And we have a resource from partners of ours that we'll include with the webinar materials when we send them out afterwards around how to talk to immigrant families about public charge. We want to be absolutely sure that when the proposed rule comes out, people do not think that it is final and do not think that it is in effect. And so it'll be really important for all of those pre-K and Head Start programs to have accurate information to share with families. So we'll get you those that fact sheet as well. There was a question regarding
whether or not in the recommendations we have, we're asking for immigration status not to be asked in the next census, and that's actually a great question. It's not one of our specific recommendations, but obviously we know that any questions related to immigration status on the census is going to create a chilling effect and result in the undercounting of children in immigrant families. So we appreciate that question. There's also a question on, do we have any recommendations for home visiting programs, specifically how or what programs do to maintain their retention rates related to families who drop out of the program due to fear?
That's a great question. And I think, we're trying to collect some of the best practices around how to, again, get accurate information out to communities so that families feel safe continuing to access services. We do know that on home visiting in particular, providers talk to us about adapting their practices. So it might be that instead of going into the home, they began meeting with families in other locations where families felt more comfortable. So I do think it's important both to get information out as well as to think about how practices can be adapted to meet the specific needs of families.
There's also a question about, let's see, we're just trying to pick one. We have so many questions, we're trying to break them down and get to as many as possible. Let's see. There was one question regarding whether certain demographic information has to be reported to government agencies in order to continue receiving certain grants, and that some governmental programs have had to submit demographic information. When we mentioned that eligibility has, and then the question is like, do clients, is this not the case? Should they not have to collect this information? There's all, the types of demographic information that have had to be collected previously, and for some programs, for some benefit programs, immigration status does have to be collected depending on who the beneficiary is. Basically what we're saying is that all the rules that have been in place before are still apply, but so do the privacy and confidentiality protections. So these are information that should be passed on solely for the purpose of determining eligibility for a program, not information that's supposed to be handed over to ICE. And I'm not sure if that answers that question, but I just wanted to clarify that there wasn't any changes to, there shouldn't be any new questions around immigration status for programs that haven't had to track that in the past.
We have a couple of questions related to mental health resources, specifically around the lack of bilingual mental health providers, as well as lack of resources for funding mental health services. And on that, we would reiterate that we understand that there is a huge deficit of bilingual and culturally competent mental health providers. And in many cases, it was mental health services, particularly for adults, that was relayed to us as one of the greatest needs, and yet a service that families most often cannot access. As I said at the beginning, we have recommendations for a range of stakeholders. For those in the funder community who are on the webinar, this is one of the areas where we think that a major step forward would be a really comprehensive effort to get resources to a number of areas where there is such unmet need, and certainly mental health services, particularly for immigrant parents, is one critical area.
We have a question about whether the reports looked into stress, racism, and xenophobia that children might experience in school, given that we mentioned those issues being experienced by staff. So we do touch on that briefly in the report and the consequences of experiencing racism and bullying on kids kind of developing self-identities. Because of the ages of the children that we were focused on, that issue came up a little bit less common or a little bit less frequently than it would, I think, with older children. Oftentimes when providers spoke about that, they were talking about older kids who were in middle or high school, or even, there were definitely concerns about racism and bullying in elementary schools as well. And, you know, there were definitely a couple of stories about preschool-age kids kind of throwing around Trump as a relational bullying tool. So it's definitely a concern, but not something that we heard super frequently among early childhood providers.
And from the parent focus groups we conducted, there was a question about whether we talked to non-staff parents, and we did conduct 4 focus groups in 3 of the states that we visited. And we also heard from those parents that young children, in addition to experiencing racism, were also just having a hard time understanding what immigration status was and conflating one thing with the other. There's a question about whether we have brochures or small posters that people can post in their office. As Hannah mentioned earlier in the early childhood report, there is a fact sheet that you can put up in your classrooms or in your buildings that outlines the sensitive locations policy, and that early childhood programs fall under that policy.
I think we have time for one more question. I'll try to answer 2 at once. One was about whether or not there were practices for early childhood programs to provide supports to staff who are dealing with families, as well as overall kind of thinking about effective ways that organizations have been able to address some of these issues. So I think one of the big findings was that early childhood programs that had strong relationships with community-based partners, in particular immigrant-serving organizations, were able to really meet more of their families' needs, and also were able to better build trust with families. When those relationships are strong, then families get reassurance from both organizations about the safety of participating in those programs. So those partnerships are really important, both for the information as well as for the credibility and for family safety. We did hear about some programs rethinking the way that they work with or supervise staff, to give them more time to check in with supervisors, to have access to social workers or others who might be on staff to actually provide services to parents, but could also provide services to staff. So I think some of those models of how to support staff are really emerging, and we hope to continue identifying and sharing those practices as we learn them. We will continue to weave through the questions that we've gotten and hope to address some in follow-up to this webinar. We are at the end of our time, so I just want to thank you so much. Marlene, if you go to the next slide, we can share our contact information. Please do check out the reports online and contact us for additional information. Next slide, Marlene, including concerns specific to sensitive locations policy violations, as well as other questions that you may